Trade Negotiator for Nigeria and Director General in the Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiations. Thank you very much, and I'll now hand over to the chairman of this session to conduct further proceedings. Thank you.
Good afternoon, every one of you. It's always tough to have sessions immediately after lunch, although it just depends on what angle you take it from. Because for somebody like me, I like to speak immediately after lunch because I know many of you will be distracted. And so you wouldn't understand what I'm talking about and just simply get away with blue bother. Now, I want every one of you here to take in perspective the session we're going to have. It still continues with the theme for the overall conference. We're looking at what we should be doing regarding the African Free Trade Area. Now, just as a reminder, if you all, those of you who were around, when the discussion around the World Trade Organization started, the globalization debate, you recall in the first conference the SBL had in 2006, that was tabled. And what happened at the time was that there was little or no awareness about what this whole globalization thing was about. And we tried to avoid knee-jerk reaction on the part of lawyers to it. So what we did was simply to make it a constant topic and discourse in our conferences, so that in creating the awareness, we not only got lawyers to understand what the entire concept of globalization was, but we tried to get them to understand the roles they can play in this area. And there are times you must recognize when you cannot stop something. Globalization, once the train left that station, it was not going to come back. But it was left to us to do the things we needed to do to ensure that we get our own fair share of world trade. And in this case, trade is not just in goods, but also in services. Now, it is somewhat fortuitous that this same debate is now repeating itself, but this time we're looking at it at a continental level. And we must ask ourselves, what can we as lawyers, what role can we play to ensure that we get the best out of this? Again, like a train out of the station, it's left the station. What can we do? You must always look at two sides of any spectrum when these debates come about. We are lawyers, 160,000 at the last count. The SBL just represents a teeny-weeny proportion of the overall lawyer population. And dare I say, we're also very well trained. And I give kudos to every one of you here who has found the need to come here and continue to grow your knowledge. But this knowledge need not be restricted to your country. When you open up borders, you can actually ply your trade. And what other profession can benefit more if we expand our territories? There are myriads of agreements to be drawn up. There are dispute resolution mechanisms to look at. And there are simply trade agreements that can be done. So we need to keep an open mind, listen to the experts who had to put the paperwork together. And they're now out here to let us know the role we can play. And it is important that we listen, because we lawyers are opinion influencers. And what better way can this have shown itself when we had the vice president himself, one of us, declare this conference open. And talking about the vice president, he, like the current Minister of State for Petroleum Resources and the Minister of Budget and Planning, and that is Dr. Ibe Kachiku and Mr. Udoma, we're all foundation members of the section on business law. So what greater influence could we exert on policy if we don't take advantage of these people in strategic positions that can help advance our cause? So you are all opinion molders, and you can influence government thinking. So keep your minds, listen to what the experts have to tell us. Today, we're going to get a report of this entire free trade area. And the experts will tell you how the process started, what the findings were, and then each of them will intervene in special areas. And thereafter, I expect that every one of you would be fundamentally informed about the benefits or the challenges that come with it and how we can respond to it. So on that note, help me welcome Dr. Ismail Fazel, who is going to give us the overall view. Please, you're back for lunch. You must be energized. And just as he comes over, I want to add my thank you to the one by Cecilia to UNECA. Thank you very much for this partnership. We know it can always inure to the benefit of a succeeding generation of lawyers. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to the NBA and the section on business law for this invitation. It's a tremendous privilege for me to be here in Abuja, and especially with this illustrious panel that you've put together. I think you really had the foresight. You saw the future when you created the section on business law. Its time has come, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me also thank the ECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, for firstly inviting me to participate in a research project last year, which was supposed to be a long paper. It turned out to be a book, and the book is now published in a few languages, I think more than one, and available. I was asked to envision the CFTA, because at the time I was working on it, the CFTA was still being negotiated, successfully now concluded. And I want to thank my friend, colleague, and mentor, I should say, Chaido Osakwe, who I met a long time ago. My hair was also black, all black, and I think he didn't have any gray hairs then. We met in Geneva. He was the first African director in the World Trade Organization. He was advisor to the Director General then of the WTO, Mike Moore. And he certainly is one of the most competent and capable WTO officials that I know. And I'm very pleased that he's now in the trenches, where I spent a lot of my own life. And a few words about my own work. I, of course, started work in the government of South Africa in the first week of the new government of Nelson Mandela in 1994. And we had no prior training in trade negotiations, so I had to hit the ground running. It was all learning by doing. I led all our trade negotiations then with SACU, the Southern African Customs Union. We had to democratize it, we had to modernize it. With SADC, as we joined SADC for the first time, a democratic South Africa, we led the negotiations for a free trade area in SADC. And in parallel, I also started a negotiation with the European Union, and we negotiated a free trade agreement with the European Union, which was concluded, the first one in 2000. And I also led a number of other negotiations with other trading partners around the world. And in 2002, after we launched the Doha round, I found myself in Geneva, something I had not envisaged. I was a government employee, a public servant, so I was deployed, sent to Geneva, and I then became the chief negotiator of South Africa in the World Trade Organization. I've returned to South Africa, decided to take a step back. I now teach at the University of Cape Town. I teach a course on international trade law, and some Nigerians are now participating in the trade programs that we run there, including a few PhDs. And my colleague and partner in the course that I teach is, her name is Ada Odo, a professor who from Nigeria, now based in Cape Town. So we are building linkages. And in my old age, I'm now spending a lot of time talking about trade and working on regional integration on the continent, which is my pet project. So we worked on this research project last year, and we produced a book. The idea was to envision how the CFTA, how the Continental Free Trade Agreement would look like. I wanted to say a few words about the CFTA. Of course, part of my job is to try and promote the concept, but I know that I'm here amongst people who are willing and ardent supporters of regional integration, so I don't have to do a lot of work in this regard. I've also been preceded by a fantastic presentation made by Chaidu Osakwe earlier this morning and other colleagues here. But I wanted to provide a few insights which are in the book that you will get from ECA, and talk a little bit about the history, because many people say, well, you know, why has it taken you so long in Africa? And I think we need to understand why. What were some of the reasons for that? Where does this come from? Where does the regional integration project come from? How did we suddenly land with a ACFTA? And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we witnessed, Chaidu and myself, as we worked in Geneva, the changes we witnessed in the world, and the impact that it had on Africa, and why that has influenced the direction of this project, the regional integration project on the continent. And I wanted to talk a little bit more also about how we build the CFTA. How do we ensure that the regional project we build doesn't suffer the same fate as the crisis of regional integration in Europe today? How do we ensure that we build in mechanisms into the CFTA so that it is able to share the benefits of trade across the continent, not only among some of the bigger players, but also the smaller countries on the continent? And if there's time, I'll share a few thoughts with you about how I think Africa is poised to take advantage of the CFTA through building regional industrial value chains across the continent. So a little bit about the history. Of course, there was a dream. There was a dream by Pan-African leaders long before the process of decolonization started. People like Kwame Nkrumah and others in exile were thinking about how they would rebuild the continent. And it brought together Africans in exile, wherever they were, a bit like South Africans who were in exile before the release of Nelson Mandela. They were dreaming about the future, and they dreamt about a united African continent. But when the process of decolonization began, with the independence of Ghana and other countries, leaders began to deal with very complex domestic challenges. Issues of neocolonialism, dealing with borders, economic development, and of course, rebel forces, the Cold War, and the project of regional integration had to take a back seat. it was also not a very favorable climate internationally. As we got into the 70s and the 1980s, the world economy went into crisis. African countries were beginning to run into high levels of debt, low growth rates, increasing poverty. But it didn't stop. A very interesting person called Adebayo Adedeji, I believe you all know him. He comes from right here in Abuja. He dreamt of how he would translate this vision by Pan-African leaders into a project for regional integration on the continent. And so came the Lagos Plan of Action and the Abuja Treaty in 1991. He, of course, was working with others, with other leaders in other developing countries, people like Prebish, who became the first General Secretary of the United Nations Commission for Africa, and they thought about how they could merge the processes of regional integration with economic development. And they came up with a concept of developmental integration. And this was a very different concept to the project that was going on in the European Union in the 1950s, as the Europeans came out of the war, 2 wars on the continent. They decided, never again, we need to build peace, and to underpin that peace, we need to cooperate and rebuild our economies. And the process of reconstruction started. In 1951, they came together, 6 countries, to create the European Coal and Steel Agreement, cooperating together to rebuild their industries. And in 1957, they created the EEC, the European Economic Community. They dreamt at that time of a regional integration project. It was a dream, because if you were in Europe at that time, you would know that almost all the economies in Europe after the war had been in crisis. Almost every country was going through a process of reconstruction, and many countries had been in conflict with each other. And so it was a dream to build a regional integration project. They soldiered on, and in the 1980s, they built a single market, led again by leaders on the European continent. They freed the market of encumbrances at the border, both in goods and services, and the European project continued. Now in Africa, when Adebayo Adedeji began to put in place this project of regional integration in Africa, he had a global vision. He could see what was happening around the world, and he believed that in Africa we needed to build a project which was different from Europe, because African economies were different, their levels of development were different, and he knew that trade alone was not sufficient. We needed to do something about building the productive capacity of African countries to ensure that they didn't just export primary products, but they were able to build manufacturers and trade with each other. And it was during this time, unfortunately, that the project could not go forward, because in the 1980s, we had a proliferation of new ideas in Washington, something called the Washington Consensus, the idea that the freer that you were, the more the state withdrew, the more you let the market, you left the market to its own, the more you were able to reap the benefits of trade and economic development. And as we know, this was not to be. Many mistakes were made on our continent, poor advice, and it brought many countries to the brink of despair, and African countries were in crisis. And as we got to the new millennium in the year 2000, we had a very unfortunate headline in a leading magazine called The Economist. It said, Africa, the hopeless continent. It was a very unfortunate, but it did reflect where Africa was. 2 decades of lost development, 2 decades that could have been used to advance the process of regional integration. Now, this is when I met Chaidu, in Geneva. What was happening at the time? The WTO just launched a new round. China joined the WTO. China was working hard. From the 1980s, its leader, Deng Xiaoping, decided to experiment and create an EPZ, an economic processing zone, in Shenzhen, just behind Hong Kong. By the year 2001, 2002, as they joined the WTO, China had already been growing at more than 10% a year for more than 2 decades. By 2004, China overtook Japan to become the largest exporter in Asia. By 2007, they overtook Germany. And by 2009, they overtook the United States to become the largest exporter in the world. What did this do? And why is this interesting for Africa? Because as China was growing, it was sucking in imports. It was sucking in raw materials, agricultural products from around the world, raising prices, enabling growth rates to rise in Africa, and right across the continent, we had a spurt of growth we've never seen in the history of the continent. In the first decade of the new millennium, African countries grew at more than 5% on average. Our neighbors from the south, in Angola, they were growing at 17%, Mozambique at 13%, Ethiopia growing at over 11%, and Ethiopia still growing at over 10%. So this was the context which changed the narrative about Africa. Now in 2010, the McKinsey Group said Africa is rising. And African countries were beginning to put in place policies to address the underlying structural problems. Today, every single country on the continent has an industrial policy. Not every country is implementing it yet, but they have a vision to industrialize. This was the context that made ministers and leaders on the continent think again about how they can implement the dream of Pan-African leaders and the dream of Adebayo Adedeji. And I think the first big steps that were taken were to relaunch that project through the trilateral free trade agreement between SADC, COMESA, and the EAC, the East African Community, and then in 2015 to expand that to the rest of the continent and launch the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And on the 21st of March in Kigali, where the agreements, the hard work that Chaidu and others put in was signed, we launched truly a historic agreement. Historic because of the dream that was there long before. Now, again, we are trying to see how we can implement a regional project which doesn't follow Europe, but learns from the lessons of European integration. A recent book written by Joseph Stiglitz says that European integration has lost its way.
Ishmael, I don't want to hurry you, but
okay.
I need to get into it.
So our challenge in Africa is to see how, as we begin to implement regional integration, we're able to advance trade integration alongside building industrial capacity, infrastructure, and ensuring that the benefits of integration are shared between all the countries on the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know there's a lot more to say, but we'll need the intervention of some of our best speakers here. And let me start with Dr. Adeyemi Digbolu. Yesterday, the Vice President noted that part of the reluctance of Nigeria's involvement has to do with the fear that the little gains we have made on the path to industrialization might be jeopardized if we hurry to sign this. I just want you to throw some more light on this. Is there really a tension between the CFTA and industrialization? Speak from you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And I just will go straight to the point, given the time limitations. Just to say that, in my own view, the African Continental Free Trade Area must be a vehicle for transformative industrialization. By transformative industrialization, I'm talking about the kind of industrialization that creates jobs, that promotes structural transformation, that raises incomes and reduces our dependence on primary commodities. And for that industrialization to be transformative, I do believe that we have to improve on our lack of competitiveness. We also have to overcome the constraints that happen when you industrialize without exporting. In other words, you run into a foreign exchange constraint, the kind of which we saw during the last recession, where manufacturing suffered because there were no foreign exchange earnings from oil. And also, I think the kind of industrialization where if we give incentives to industry, we must demand performance from them. We must say, if I give you protection for 6 years, by the 6th year, I should be able to reduce some of the protection that I'm giving to you. And I think we also need a transformative industrial policy that enables us to cope better with the international environment, overcome some of the constraints of the structural adjustment programs, which Ambassador Faisal spoke about, but also helping us to realize that the nature of global industrialization is changing. You have what you call global value chains now. And just to take the car industry, for instance, nobody makes a car in one place now. The various components are made across various parts of the world. And what is significant about that is that the components have to be able to move freely between countries. Now, what will be those requirements for the transformative industrial policy I'm advocating? The first of all is that, of course, you have to articulate very clearly an industrial strategy that balances your interest between exports and import substitution. An industrial strategy that identifies priorities. What are the sectors that the nation is going to give priority to? If you give priority to every sector, then you really are not prioritizing anything. I think we also have to create an industrial ecosystem, the dedicated infrastructure to support industrialization, the development finance that enables new companies to be able to compete effectively. We also have to promote what I call internal articulation, by which I mean that there must be linkages between goods produced within the market. So just a very simple example of crude oil should be refined within the economy, should be transported within the economy, should be converted to plastics within the economy. So I say this because trying to industrialize without taking account of without taking a strategic approach may be problematic. So the point I'm trying to make, therefore, is that the African Continental Free Trade Area can promote transformative industrialization because it enables larger markets and economies of scale. So just by being able to sell in a larger market, most manufacturing goods to be competitive need large markets. So I think that's an important element. The other important element is that it will compel us to create regional infrastructure. We'll improve the air links, the sea links, the road links between our countries in order for trade to be able to move competitively. It will also enable or require harmonized rules and standards. And I remember talking to the promoter of Main 1 at the height of when she was building this subsea cable from Europe to Africa. And she told me the problems she had in every country she had to land. She had to go and engage with a different set of authorities, with a different set of rules and a different set of requirements. So it's important in talking about the AFCTA, CFTA, to think very strongly about how do we harmonize the rules and regulations and standards. But also critical and linked to the global value chains I mentioned is that we must develop regional value chains. It must be possible now for us to be able to add value to raw materials, say making chocolates. Nigeria should be able to buy chocolates from Ghana, cocoa from Ghana, and make chocolates in Nigeria and export them to Cameroon. And we need to develop those regional value chains if we are going to be part of what is happening in the rest of the world.
Let me stop you there.
2 points.
Okay.
Just 2 points. However, and it's critical because that was just everybody's happy. Now I'm going to provoke you a bit. We have to overcome certain challenges when we talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area. The first, and I think in the context of Nigeria may not matter so much, is the whole issue of the potential revenue losses from tariffs. If you lower your trade barriers, you may lose some tariff revenue. There's also the problem of the AFCTA may undermine industrial policy objectives. The word is may. In other words, if you have sensitive products that you want to really produce domestically, it's essential to ensure that in negotiations, you take account of your sensitive products and you protect your sensitive products. Having said that, it's no use protecting your sensitive products in the negotiating process if you don't have effective border management. In other words, if smuggling is taking place as it is taking place now, it's not the CFTA that is going to lead to increased lack of competitiveness. It's already happening, and so we need effective border management. We also need to guard against what I call the abuse of rules of origin. And it's very simple, really. It's very possible for a manufacturer in an advanced country, because of what they consider to be easier conditions in another country, to go up and set up a factory, or not a factory, set up a warehouse, then label it made in country X. I don't want to mention any country, I'll just give you an example, and then send it to Nigeria because that country is within the CFTA. So we have to guard against that. I think just to end there, you need also to have an architecture for trade remedies. It's also essential that you should, through a rule-based system, and that is the critical element of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It probably gives you a rule-based means by which you can engage with your neighbors, other African countries, for trade remedies. So just to conclude, I think some of the lessons of our own process are the requirements for deep and rigorous consultations, the need to have enforceable provisions in the African Continental Free Trade Area, the need for us to think about all times about how do we balance the interests of those who want to export and those who think that the domestic market should be protected for their interest. And finally, I say that we have to recognize at all times that we are part of the world. The world economy is changing. Services are taking a far greater role than hitherto. And so when you assess competitiveness, you have to assess it also from the competitiveness of your services industry. And finally, just to say that, this is final. Final, just to say, the other one was overall final. But the point really is just to say that in finalizing the African Continental Free Trade Area, we have to build a structure that down the line will not suffer from the tensions that you have in the European Union and in the North American Free Trade Area. I think it's essential that we don't say, let's do it now, and in 20 years' time, someone comes and says, let's unravel it. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, big round of applause for him. Now, he ended up on a note that talks about how we can manage the regional integration that's anticipated under this agreement. So perhaps I can call Dr. Badejo at this point. Can you elaborate a little bit on the CFTA and regional integration?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me follow the Vice President yesterday, who apologized for not being properly dressed as a lawyer. But here I am operating more as a political scientist, which has been my main calling. And also, let me clarify by saying that I am not an ambassador. The people in my village, Odoshenlu, in the outskirts of Ijebu, they call me ambassador because I was working for the UN outside, but that doesn't make me an ambassador. I thought that I was very happy that Dr. Ismail provided some background on regional integration in terms of how did we get here. And it is unfortunate that Professor Adebayo Adedeji died on April 25 this year. He is to be buried in Ijebu-Ode on July 6th. And it was sad that Nigeria did not sign in Kigali for a dying man that spent his life in struggling for integration in Africa in reaction against the kind of economics he was taught at the London School of Economics when he started seeing interests that are different between the developing countries and our own situation. The fact of the matter is he worked so hard. There was the the Abuja Treaty, and I remember actually being one of those analyzing the Abuja Treaty in 1991 on the platform of the Nigerian Institute for Advanced Legal Studies. I want to thank ECA for giving us the opportunity to talk about this, because some of the institutions we had that provided the consultations those days are still there, but they don't function anymore. NIA and Nigerians, they don't interest themselves in much of this, and we have to have ECA make us talk about some of these among ourselves, which is great and appreciated. Of course, the question of trying to embark on an integration process must involve cost-benefit analysis. That is, the country looks at what is it likely going to get at the end of the day. But for a big country like Nigeria, it is also a variable of how you do the calculation of your cost and benefit analysis. If you are looking at how many companies do you have and how many of them can really export, and then you are trying protectionist and calculating what you will lose on tariffs, but you are not also paying attention to what multilateralism means for the largest economy in Africa, the largest population in Africa, in terms of pulling the other African countries together towards a goal of industrialization and development of Africa, then that is myopic. And I think those calculus that we are doing are wrong, because what comes out of deep integration, integration is not new for us. Adedeji started with ECOWAS as the father of ECOWAS, and when he got into the ECA with the African Union, the concept of replicating ECOWAS all over in having various regional economic commissions, with the intention that by the year 2023, we will actually not be talking about AFCTA, we will be talking about an African Economic Community. We are still far from that, given the debate that we are talking about. There are many things that I could quickly run over, but I would like to tell you a simple story from Yoruba mythology. Obatala is the king of all Orishas of the Yorubas, and specifically Obatala and his entourage were going through a village and they needed to stay the night. And they saw a farmer and his wife and children totally poor. And they said, how are you surviving? They say, you see that cow there? It gives us milk and whatever fruits we can pluck from here and there, we survive. They gave them a good treatment for the night. Then, as he left them, he told one of his aides to go back and throw that cattle that was giving them milk over the cliff. And I said, but this is bad. How can you do that? These people took care of you for the night. Why do you want to kill their cow? He said, go and do it. They did it. When they were coming back through that same place years later, they saw a flourishing family. And they were happy. Then they stopped and they said, how come you are this guy? I said, oh, you know, our cow was over the cliff and he died. And because he died, we started doing a lot for ourselves to eke out a living. That is perhaps the complacency of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria that we need to fight.
Thank you. I will stop you there because I don't want to lose that trend. The message I get there is we must be thinking about diversification. And Dr. Karingi, let me bring you in there. What are your thoughts on diversification?
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon. We spoke in the morning. So let me start by saying the following. So the agreement that was signed in Kigali, it had some numbers in terms of the liberalization schedule. And I think Ambassador Osakwe did try to sketch that out for us. So what we have done at the Economic Commission for Africa, we have taken those modalities, as you would call them in the legal jargon, and we have tried to look at what do they exactly mean. What we have found out is that all African countries are going to benefit from the CFTA. So that's the first point. Now, the second thing we have found out, even the smallest and the poorest, least developed countries in Africa are also going to benefit from the CFTA. But how are they going to benefit? If you look at the structure of Africa's trade today, I think we have heard a lot about this. Most of what we trade with the rest of the world is extractives. But we actually have a very good base of what we are trading together today. And this is where the element of diversification comes in. Only 40% of our intra-African trade is on extractives. 60% of our intra-African trade is actually non-extractives. What is the beauty of this kind of trade? First of all, it allows us to be protected from the volatility of the prices as we see under the trade of extractives with the rest of the world. Two, unlike extractives, this non-extractives trade, it tends to be more labor intensive, whereas the extractives tends to be capital intensive. And so when we ran these simulations that showed us that all the African countries are going to benefit, we wanted to know what is going to happen to this good intra-African trade that we are seeing. And by the way, at this point, let me correct some of the figures that have been said before. The level of intra-African trade now is at least 16%. So we've actually been making progress. But so, what will the CFTA do? We found out that if you put those modalities of the CFTA into place, you are likely to get at least an extra $62 billion in terms of intra-African exports. But what is so good about these $62 billion of extra exports, intra-African trade in exports. It is that more than $40 billion of that, that's about 2/3 of that increased intra-African exports, is actually going to be on value-added goods. Again, remember the advantages that I gave of value-added goods. But there's also an important story in this additional intra-African trade in value-added goods. Now, today, at least 30% of the inputs that go into manufacturing are services. Ambassador Ademi has talked about services. What are these services? It's the banking services, it's the insurance services, it's the logistics services, it's other business services, including accounting and legal services like the ones that you provide. So when we talk about diversification, it is not just the additional $40 billion of extra intra-African trade in exports, but also the services that go into that help to diversify the economy. So, but what are some of the industrial goods that are going to be contributing to this additional intra-African trade of value-added goods? The sectors that we saw to be doing very well in our analysis are things like textiles, wood and paper, vehicle and transport equipment. And so the question I would want to ask here, does the Nigerian economy have a base for these sectors? Because there is clarity in our simulations that these sectors are going to grow within the continent. So, moderator, let me conclude by saying the following. When the African heads of state, including the Nigerian president, agreed to negotiate the CFTA in 2012, they also agreed on something called the Boosting Intra-African Trade Action Plan. And what is the Boosting Intra-African Trade Action Plan? It is actually the pillars upon which the productive capacity, the infrastructure that is supposed to support the free trade are supposed to be built around. So there are 7 pillars. One of them is on productive capacity, another one on infrastructure development, another one on trade facilitation, including trade-related services. So it is not that the CFTA will be standing or without any legs. It is expected that each individual country will have a national plan and a national strategy upon which it can build the pillars as identified in the Boosting Intra-African Trade, and these are the pillars that are going to ensure that the country optimizes on the CFTA. And again, I want to repeat, the conversation that Nigeria is having now of how to address the competitiveness question is well captured in the Boosting Intra-African Trade Action Plan, for as long as the Minister for Finance here and the Minister for Planning are going to identify that and put money into it. So that's my intervention.
Thank you. I like that. I must bring in Ambassador Chiedu Osakwe, and in doing that, I really want you all to give him a round of applause. He's been a worthy and son of this country. He's been to the WTO, has represented us everywhere, and most of these dreams are dreams when they see gathering like this, gives them the fillip. And I think they all accept the thank you we're giving them for the good work that they're doing. But Ambassador Osakwe, our problem here is this fear of dumping. And it's a real fear. We get integrated regionally. We are doing our best. And then there's a weak link nation that then imports from these countries that are wont to dump in goods. And then these goods find their way here. The Vice President mentioned about it. So what is a safeguard for this, Ambassador?
Thank you very much, George, and everyone. Let me, in 5 minutes or slightly less, make 3 points overall. Point number 1 would be a strategic understanding of the type of game that we would like our country, Nigeria, to play. Second would be to respond to George Tommy's question regarding trade defense, trade remedies, and I'll add to that the role of lawyers, because that's where your role will be fundamental. And then I will conclude on, I have to show my colors, my zebra colors, what I actually think should be the way we would handle intra-African cooperation. And all this can be done in 5 minutes. And on the last point, I'll make a couple of sub-points about a process and a path that Ambassador Faisal Ismail and a couple of others of us led at the WTO, where we were only 4 or 5 Africans in the early 90s thinking about the issues that we are thinking today. We were beleaguered. We were beleaguered then. And he recalled it, and he played a greater role, much more than I did, but his comments were flattering. Point number 1, we have to think, don't misinterpret me, the way the Europeans think, the way the Americans think, the way the great civilizations conceived of civilization, of building cathedrals over time, not in a personalized way of something that would be completed tomorrow, but a work for the ages. And in strategically conceptualizing how we play. I know what matters to many people in the world today is the metaphor from soccer. How do you play it to win? And there are a couple of models, 2-3 models. Do you play a Barcelona FC game where the strategy is possession football? The understanding is if you can't hold the ball, you can't score and you can't win the game. Do you play Nigerian soccer that really excited the world about 20 years ago? The same model as the German soccer strike force, attacking, aggressive, ambitious, enterprising, scoring goals. Or do you relax into a defensive mode where they may not score against you, but the likelihood is that you'll never take the trophy? So we have to think about this in this way. And remember, I can be impugned for all the points I've made. Think like the Europeans, think like the Americans, think in terms of soccer metaphor. I own things that I say. It's fine with me. To George's point, what we have built in to the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area is an ironclad trade remedy infrastructure. It's under the protocol on goods. It's the annex on trade remedies, and it's broken down into 3. One is anti-dumping, where you can apply offsetting duties to another country, a state party X, that has produced good, $100, and is selling it in Nigeria at 50, basically predatory, kill the competition, corner the market, and revert to the original price. And so we have the provisions you can have offsetting duties. The other is a more insidious form of trade distortion. This is produced in state party X. But because that state party may have a deeper treasury, it subsidizes in a way that raises production, controls the global market prices for that particular thing, and dumps it. And so this is not a tariff issue. This is not a pricing issue. It's a subsidy issue. And we have built in a provision in the Trade Remedy Annex on subsidies on countervailing duties for the subsidies. It's in there. And then, of course, you have the handbrake, the preferential safeguards. But how would it work? It would only work with you, the lawyers. That's how it works at the WTO. You know, the lawyers that come $900 an hour. The Brussels lawyer that Saji Agwagbade spoke about in the morning. And so here is my charge to you, the lawyers. In your section on business law, develop a unit on trade law, on the use of trade remedies, and the use of the protocol on the rules and procedures for dispute settlement. We don't have the capacity. I am just a negotiator. I can't do it. We call it the nuclear option of the WTO, and so you can zap, and so you can do things. So you need to do this. And I've spoken to Professor Adekunle, the Director General of the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. And I said to him to establish a relationship with you here in the MBA so that we have an MOU. It's a private conversation, but now I'm putting it to the professional body. And you can ask DG. So we have an MOU, and so you can help the Nigerian government do this. Because the government can't do it. The Ministry of Justice cannot do it. It has to be done by professional lawyers. This is one huge takeaway from this conference to you. Let me conclude. When I got to, it wasn't the WTO then, it was the GATT. It was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. 1 minute, countdown. There were only 4 or 5 African delegations who were there at the WTO. South Africa. That was before Faisal came. I did not know trade policy. So an old man, I remember his name was Brahms Ruit, since retired, white South African. He came to me and said, "You're Nigerian, can I teach you? Because you barely know what you're talking about." And he was a friendly guy. So he was the one who mentored me, and it was only South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, Egypt, and Tunisia. There was no other African country at the GATT. To conclude, one sentence. I actually believe in intra-African cooperation for trade. I do. I see it from the perspective of what the Americans did in Europe after World War II for the Marshall Plan. I see it in what our country, Nigeria, has done, apropos Professor Adedeji, ECOWAS, and what the role we played on the AFCFTA. So there's work to be done, but a lot of it will turn on the expertise and the capacity that you, the lawyers, will provide in a fundamentalist sense.
Thank you very much. And that is such a fitting way to bring such an exciting session to a close. I know many of you are itching to ask questions, but the time is fast spent. We have to be out of here in 4 minutes. So what I'd say is that all the panelists will be available. That's part of why you are here. Network with them, ask them questions. The advice given that we should form some relationship with the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, set up a trade unit within the SBL, I think is well taken. We should do that. We did that in years back, which was why we have the sort of voice that we have today. Those of you who already do work in the west coast of Africa will agree with me that regional integration is so critical. We're not talking to ourselves. From the language, every West African should ideally be bilingual. It should be taken for granted. But I know many of us studied French in school, had A's in the theory, but zilch when it comes to practice. But really, we should all be bilingual. I just came back from a trip to Dakar. Oil has been discovered almost along the entire Gulf of Guinea. And there was an upstream West African summit on oil and gas. The interest most of them took in me when I spoke was what lessons they could learn from the mistakes we made in Nigeria. I didn't take it badly at all, because that's the way you advance. And I readily shared those thoughts with them. But one thing came out clear after my interaction with them. If we do not talk to each other, if we do not, charity, they say, begins at home. If we do not consolidate what belongs to us, there will always be scavengers. Nature abhors a vacuum. If we don't do it, others will do it for you. On that note, let me ask you first to give yourselves a round of applause, then give a standing ovation to this very wonderful panel. Thank you all. Wonderful.
We would like to show appreciation. We would like to show appreciation to the panel, to members of the panel. So I'm going to call upon Mr. Chuka Ikazium, Chair of the NBA Lagos branch. But before he comes up to the stage, I would just like to announce that someone's car keys of Volkswagen, someone left their car keys of Volkswagen at the security gate. So you might just want to go and, whoever it is should please, come forward, see one of the ushers or the conference organizers to recover that. Please, can we call upon Mr. Chuka Ikazum? Thank you. Ikwazum. I do apologize. And just to announce that once we've done, just take a group photograph for everybody. It will not be individual, because we're trying to save time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You will all agree with me that this has been a most distinguished panel. And on behalf of the Nigerian Bar Association, Section on Business Law, we want to say a very big thank you to every one of you, and to make this presentation to you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And then, to our very own, thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
So we will take the group photograph now.
So, on that note, we come to the end of this plenary session. However, before we close, I'd like to announce that there is a lost key, car keys to a Hyundai Elantra, I believe. Someone in this hall is looking for that key. If you find a strange key, then please pass it to any of the coordinators or the ushers. We'd like to thank our sponsors again, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. They're headline sponsors of this event, and we appreciate them truly. I'd like to say that we will now break into two sessions. Both of them are listed on page 17 of your conference program. The first session holds in the Marquet Hall right behind the Congress Hall here. It's titled Enhancing Transport Connectivity in Africa. The next session will be holding here in this Congress Hall, and its title is Marching in Lockstep, Building Subnational Competitiveness for Global Investment. They're both listed on page 17 of your conference program, and starting immediately. Thank you.